The city hummed with its usual chaos, a symphony of honking horns, hurried footsteps. In the occasional shout that pierced through the cacophony, autumn had painted the streets in shades of amber and gold, the chill in the air mingling with the rich aroma of roasted chestnuts sold by street vendors. Yet, amidst the beauty, the divide between the world's haves and have-nots felt impossibly stark. Alexander Pierce was used to seeing that divide every day, though it rarely disturbed him. Tall, imposing, and impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, he walked with the certainty of someone who had conquered the world. His name alone was enough to open doors that most could only dream of. And yet today, as he stepped into the upscale park cafe, the usual sense of power he carried seemed, for the first time in years, slightly hollow. The cafe was quiet, a warm cocoon of chatter and clinking cutlery. Sunlight spilled through the large windows, highlighting the polished wood tables and the gleaming marble countertops. A soft jazz melody floated through the space, perfectly orchestrated to make every patron feel at ease. Alexander took his usual corner seat by the window, one hand tapping impatiently on the table. Today wasn't about pleasure, it was about strategy. A critical meeting loomed, one that could either elevate Pierce Enterprises to an untouchable global empire or leave him, scrambling to save face. He was interrupted by the waiter, who laid before him a plate so pristine it seemed almost ceremonial. A filet mignon, cooked to perfection, with a side of roasted root vegetables, glistening under a drizzle of truffle oil. Alexander inhaled deeply, savoring the aroma. His hand reached for the knife. But then a voice shattered the moment. "Don't eat that." Alexander froze. His fork hovered mid-air, his sharp blue eyes scanning the sidewalk outside. A boy maybe 12, no more than that, stood there, small and trembling in the autumn chill. His clothes were worn and filthy, threadbare at the edges, yet his posture was firm, unflinching. He was holding a cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Please help." For a moment, Alexander thought he must be imagining it. Who would dare yell at him, a billionaire, in the middle of such a posh establishment? Yet, the boy's voice rang again, more urgent this time, sharp as a whip in the crisp air. "Don't eat that." The cafe fell silent. Heads turned. Some patrons whispered, others simply stared, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Alexander's brow furrowed. Annoyance coursed through him. Mingled with a flicker of unease he didn't understand, he stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the marble floor, drawing more attention than he cared for. Ignoring the stares, he strode toward the door, his expensive shoes clicking against the pavement. The boy didn't flinch. He met Alexander's gaze with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Why are you yelling at me?" Alexander demanded, his voice cold, controlled but tinged with irritation. The boy's lips quivered, not from fear, but from the effort of holding back something urgent. Because you're about to eat something dangerous?" "I heard them." Alexander chuckled, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Dangerous? You're just a street kid. What do you know about danger?" "I know enough." The boy snapped. He stepped closer, his small hands clenched into fists. "That food, it's poisoned." The word hung in the air. Alexander's laughter died on his lips, replaced by a flicker of doubt. "Poisoned?" he repeated, incredulous. "Do you know what you're saying?" The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, extending it to Alexander with trembling fingers. The paper was hastily scribbled, almost illegible, yet the warning was clear. "The chef has been paid to harm him. Stop him before he eats it." Alexander's mind raced. Could this be true? A rival company? Corporate espionage? It wasn't impossible, yet the boy's sincerity made his usual skepticism falter. Before Alexander could respond, few bystanders leaned closer, murmuring among themselves. Some shook their heads, muttering about insolent children and panhandlers. But a few older men, veterans, businessmen, someone who had seen the world's darker corners, watched the exchange with subtle unease. There was something about the boy's gaze that demanded respect. "Why would you help me?" Alexander asked, lowering his voice as the wind tugged at the boy's hair. Because someone has to, the boy said simply. His eyes were unwavering, a mixture of fear and quiet determination that made Alexander pause. The billionaire's hand hovered over the plate, then recoiled. He swallowed hard, the realization of how close he had come to catastrophe washing over him. He glanced back at the steak, and a chill ran down his spine. That simple meal, something he had been savoring, now looked grotesque. Every aroma, every glistening edge seemed tainted. I'll check it, Alexander said finally, his voice tight. Stay here. He stepped back into the cafe, instructing the waiter to hold the order. In a few tense minutes, the restaurant manager returned, pale and stammering, confirming that a routine inspection had flagged an anomaly with the meat traces of an unusual chemical. It wasn't lethal in large doses, but enough to make anyone seriously ill. Alexander's eyes widened. The boy had been right. Outside, the boy was still standing, watching him, patient and silent. Alexander stepped out, his posture now slightly slouched, his arrogance tempered by shock. You saved my life, he said, barely above a whisper. The boy shrugged, as if it were nothing. Someone had to. Maybe next time, people will listen sooner. Alexander wanted to say more, to offer money, help, anything. But the boy simply turned and vanished into the crowd, leaving Alexander frozen on the sidewalk. The wind tugged at his coat, but he barely noticed. Something in that boy's courage had shifted something deep inside him, something that even his vast wealth had never touched. Over the next few days, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about the boy. He launched a quiet investigation into the cafe staff and suppliers, uncovering a tangled web of corruption and greed. The head chef, Marco, had indeed been bribed by a competitor desperate to see Pierce Enterprises falter. Alexander's life and empire had been in real danger, and it was the street kid's instinct and bravery that had thwarted a meticulously planned plot. But more than that, Alexander found himself haunted by the boy's courage, by the quiet, steadfast moral compass he had demonstrated. Who was this child? How could someone so young have such clarity? Determined to find him, Alexander began scouring the streets, checking shelters and asking shopkeepers if they knew of a boy matching the description. Weeks passed. Every lead seemed to fizzle. Every corner he turned brought no sign of him. Yet Alexander refused to give up. And then, one rainy evening, he saw him. Sitting on the steps of a small bookstore, shivering under a threadbare coat, the small dog curled protectively beside him. The boy looked up as Alexander approached, his gaze cautious but unyielding. I need to thank you, Alexander said, kneeling down to meet the boy's eyes. You saved my life. How can I ever repay you? The boy looked at him, eyes filled with an emotion Alexander couldn't name, part defiance, part sorrow, part longing. You don't have to, he said. Just make sure someone listens next time. Alexander nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken layers of pain and wisdom in the boy's words. He had saved Alexander, yes, but perhaps, in some ways, Alexander had also saved the boy, offering him acknowledgement, respect, and a glimpse of hope in a world that had given him so little. From that day forward, Alexander's life began to shift. It wasn't just the fear of what could have happened, it was the realization that the smallest, humblest among us can sometimes wield the most profound power. And Alexander knew, without question, that he would do everything in his power to find the boy again, to help him, and to ensure that courage and integrity like his were never ignored again. Days turned into weeks, yet Alexander Pierce could not shake the memory of the boy who had saved his life. Every boardroom meeting, every strategy call, every newspaper headline seemed to echo the same thought. Who was he? The city's pulse continued around him, taxis, honking, people rushing, neon signs flickering, but Alexander moved through it all with a strange sense of emptiness. He was a man who had always had control, who had always known the next move before anyone else. And yet, with the boy's image burned into his mind, he felt powerless. Determined, Alexander expanded his search. He hired discreet investigators to comb through local shelters, soup kitchens, and street corners. Each inquiry produced glimpses of Hapa. Shopkeeper remembered a boy, asking politely for spare change. A security guard recalled someone warning patrons outside a deli, but all these threads evaporated into nothing. The boy was elusive, like a shadow that slipped just out of reach. Meanwhile, the man who had orchestrated the poisoned meal, Marco, was still at large. Alexander had used his influence to alert law enforcement, but Marco was cautious, slippery, and connected. The chef had underestimated one thing, however: Alexander's relentless pursuit of truth. The billionaire was not merely angry, he was calculating, determined, and now fueled by a strange new sense of humility. He had seen vulnerability in a child and had been reminded of his own mortality, a fact he had long ignored. Alexander began visiting the streets himself. Each day he would walk with purpose through neighborhoods most of his peers avoided. The scents of roasted nuts and damp concrete mingled, the sounds of traffic blending with the occasional cry of street performers. He noticed faces he would have ignored before: the tired mother clutching her child, the elderly man panhandling near a subway entrance, the teenagers huddled under a fire escape. But now he looked closely, searching for someone familiar. It was on one such rainy afternoon, puddles reflect in the gray sky, that he finally found him. The boy was there again, sitting cross-legged on the steps of a library, his dog curled against him like a warm pillow. Rain dripped from his thin coat, soaking his hair and muddying his clothes, yet he remained alert, watching passers-by with keen eyes. "You again," the boy said without looking up, voice flat but not unkind. "I've been searching for you," Alexander said, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "I want to help. I want to understand who you are and why you acted so bravely." The boy's expression was unreadable. "You're rich. You don't need me," Alexander frowned, a mixture of frustration and admiration crossing his face. "I needed you more than you know. You saved my life. Do you understand that?" The boy finally met his gaze. There was something in his eyes that made Alexander catch his breath: resilience, defiance, intelligence far beyond his years. "I just couldn't let you eat it," he said softly. Alexander nodded, humbled. "And now, can I help you?" For a moment the boy hesitated. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Over the next few weeks, Alexander began learning more about the boy. His name was Elijah. He had no surviving family. His parents had died in a car accident years before, leaving him to survive on the streets. School was sporadic, food was scarce, and the city had been indifferent. Yet Elijah had a quiet dignity, a moral compass that never wavered. Even when life seemed merciless, it wasn't long before Alexander realized that Marco, the chef, had grown bolder. Rumors surfaced that he had been hired to target other executives, those who dared challenge the rival corporation. Alexander's team warned him, "Stay safe, stay away." But Alexander refused to cower. He was no longer a man solely motivated by power. Now, he had responsibility both to himself and to Elijah. Then came the day that changed everything again. Alexander and Elijah were walking through a crowded market when they overheard two men whispering. Their conversation was coded, but one name stood out: Marco. The men were planning something that sounded more sinister than before. Alexander's heart pounded. He realized that by finding Elijah, by protecting him, he had become a target once more. But he also understood that Elijah was no ordinary child. The boy had intuition, intelligence, and courage that could not be measured by age or circumstance. As they continued through the market, sudden commotion drew their attention. Marco, recognizing Alexander, had sent a group of men to intimidate him. Shouts rang out, crates toppled, and the crowd scattered. Alexander stood in the center, his suit soiled, his expression one of fury tempered by restraint. Elijah moved beside him, small but unwavering. "We can't fight them," he said calmly. "We have to outsmart them." Alexander was taken aback. This boy, this child who had nothing, was now instructing him, the billionaire, in strategy and caution. But he realized Elijah was right. Anger alone would not win this battle. Using a combination of quick thinking and subtle distractions, they navigated the chaos. Alexander was amazed at Elijah's resourcefulness. He had grown up on the streets, yes, but he had honed skills that Alexander's privileged life could never teach. The boy's calm under pressure, his ability to read intentions, to anticipate danger, was uncanny. That night, Alexander invited Elijah to his penthouse. For the first time, Elijah saw a life of comfort, of abundance. Yet he remained modest, humble, and cautious. Alexander, who had always equated power with control, felt an unfamiliar sense of vulnerability. He realized that wealth could not shield him from human nature, from treachery, or from the consequences of ignoring morality days later. Alexander uncovered an even deeper truth about Marco. He was not just a rogue chef. He was a pawn in a much larger scheme, orchestrated by a network of corporate rivals determined to destroy Alexander's empire. The stakes were higher than ever. Elijah, observing Alexander's distress, spoke up, "You can't fight them with money alone. You need strategy, patience, humility." Alexander paused, struck by the wisdom in the boy's words. He had spent his life accumulating wealth and influence, believing that fear and intimidation were enough. Yet here was a child who had nothing, guiding him with clarity and insight. Over time, their bond deepened. Alexander provided for Elijah, enrolling him in school, ensuring he had food, clothing, and shelter. But he did not shield him from lessons about life, morality, and courage. Elijah's past, his struggles, and his wisdom had already taught Alexander more than any business deal ever could. The city continued to move around them, oblivious to the silent war unfolding. Alexander's enemies were growing desperate, their schemes more aggressive. But with Elijah's insight, Alexander began to anticipate every move, turning potential ambushes into opportunities. The billionaire, once arrogant and entitled, was learning humility, patience, and the profound value of courage. Yet, just as Alexander began to feel confident, the ultimate challenge loomed, a confrontation that would test their bond, their intelligence, and their moral fortitude. Marco's next move was unpredictable, and failure was no longer an option. Alexander realized that if he underestimated the danger, both he and Elijah could pay the ultimate price in that tense, electric atmosphere. The two stood side by side, watching the city lights flicker across the wet streets. Alexander finally said, almost to himself, "Elijah, I don't know what I'd do without you." Elijah's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "And you don't know what I'd do without you." In that moment, Alexander understood that this wasn't just about survival or power. It was about trust, loyalty, and the unspoken bond forged between two very different lives, one of wealth, one of struggle linked forever by courage and morality. As night fell, Alexander and Elijah prepared for the storm ahead, unaware that the final revelation, the truth that would shake them both, was closer than either could imagine. The city's skyline glittered under the night sky, but inside Alexander Pierce's penthouse, tension crackled like static electricity. The weeks of preparation, investigation, and subtle maneuvers had led to this moment. Marco, the chef-turned-conspirator, had grown reckless. His network of hired hands was overconfident, leaving tiny gaps in security that Alexander and Elijah had noticed and quietly exploited. Elijah stood by the window, gazing out at the wet streets below. He had changed since the first day Alexander had found him on that rainy library step. The streetwise boy, cautious and wary, now moved with quiet confidence, his keen eyes missing nothing. Yet there was a softness in his expression that hinted at the relief and trust he had slowly come to place in Alexander. Alexander approached, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Elijah, tonight everything could change. Be ready." The boy turned to him, calm but resolute. "I've always been ready," he said. "We just have to act wisely." The plan was simple in theory: lure Marco into a trap, record a confession, and expose the entire network of corporate sabotage. In practice, however, the risk was enormous. One misstep, one underestimation of Marco's cunning, and the consequences could be disastrous. Alexander's mind raced, but he allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. The boy standing beside him, the one he had initially dismissed as nothing, had already changed his life in ways that no amount of money or power ever could. Elijah's courage, intelligence, and moral compass had guided him through a labyrinth of deception and danger. Then the doorbell rang. Marco had arrived. He entered the penthouse with an air of arrogance, his smug grin showing a man entirely confident in his own cunning. "Pierce," he said, voice dripping with disdain, "I hear you've been meddling in affairs far beyond your understanding." Alexander met his gaze evenly. "And I hear you've been poisoning more than just steaks, Marco? Care to explain yourself?" Marco laughed, a cruel, bitter sound. "Explain. I don't owe you explanations. I do what I must to survive. Unlike you, I play the game." Elijah stepped forward. "The game you played almost killed someone innocent, and it's over now." Marco's laughter faltered as he finally noticed the boy. You're that street rat." He spat, venom in his words. "How could a kid interfere with a man like me?" The room grew tense. Marco's men, waiting outside, had expected the usual billionaire arrogance. But instead, they found a child unafraid to stand beside a man they had all underestimated. The dynamic shifted in an instant. The arrogance that had fueled Marco's actions now began to crumble under the weight of courage, loyalty, and moral clarity. Alexander calmly activated the recording system hidden within the room. "Everything you say here will be evidence," he stated plainly, his voice unshakable, "including your intentions, the poison, and the people who hired you." Marco's composure began to falter. He glared at Alexander, then at Elijah, unable to comprehend how he had been outmaneuvered. This is impossible," he muttered. Elijah leaned forward slightly. "You underestimated me," he said simply, "and you underestimated him." He gestured toward Alexander. "We both fight differently. We don't rely on fear or wealth to win. We rely on truth and integrity." Marco's bravado shattered completely as Alexander calmly recounted the evidence they had gathered: the bribes, the poisoned steaks, the rival corporate plots. Each fact struck like a hammer, dismantling the carefully constructed facade of control that Marco had built. The men he had employed to intimidate Alexander began to realize the tide had turned. Their loyalty wavered. "Please, you don't understand." Marco stammered, but his words fell flat, meaningless in the face of the clear moral and legal consequences he now faced. Finally, with a resigned, bitter sigh, Marco slumped into a chair. Alexander's security team, previously hidden, stepped forward and took the chef into custody. The danger had passed. The threat was neutralized. But more than that, a deeper revelation was about to unfold. Alexander turned to Elijah, a question forming on his lips. "There's something I need to tell you." "Something I should have said from the start." Elijah looked puzzled. "What is it?" Alexander reached for an old photograph he had kept hidden in his office. It was a picture of a young woman, her eyes warm and strikingly familiar. "This is your mother," he said quietly. "And you're my nephew." Elijah froze, the words striking him like a thunderclap. He stared at the photograph, tracing the face with his eyes. My mother. "And you." "Yes," Alexander said, emotion cracking his usual stoic tone. "She was my sister. You were never truly alone. You survived through unimaginable hardship, but now you have family." Elijah's mind whirled. Memories, losses, survival, courage all converged with this single truth. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked at Alexander. The man who had saved him, guided him, and now revealed the most profound truth of all. They were connected by blood, by fate, and by the courage that had defined both of their lives in the days that followed. The story of Marco's exposure and the reunion of Alexander and Elijah made headlines. The public marveled at the tale of a billionaire humbled by a homeless child, unaware that the child was, in fact, family. Yet for Alexander and Elijah, the story was far more personal. It was about trust, morality, courage, and the profound bond that could exist between two souls from vastly different worlds. The penthouse, once a fortress of wealth and solitude, now felt alive. Elijah laughed freely, attended school, and began to thrive in a way he never had before. Alexander, once consumed by ambition and arrogance, found joy in mentorship, family, and the quiet moments that had eluded him for so long. And yet, the lessons were not just theirs. Everywhere they went, from boardrooms to neighborhoods, people witnessed the power of integrity, courage, and empathy. Alexander had learned that wealth could protect the body, but only moral courage and compassion could protect the soul. Elijah had learned that even amidst loss and hardship, trust and kindness could open doors that no force could close. This story reminds us to never judge others by appearances. True courage, wisdom, and integrity can reside in the most unexpected places. Wealth, power, and status do not define the worth of a person. Actions do. The homeless child who saved a billionaire was not just a hero. He was a teacher, a guide, and a mirror reflecting the virtues that had been forgotten in the pursuit of material success. Let this story inspire you to look beyond the surface, to honor the bravery and integrity in everyone you meet, and to remember that compassion, patience, and moral courage are the true measures of greatness. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from those we least expect, but those lessons can change lives forever.